So this week we're looking at industrial America through the progressive era, and a key figure in the history of the progressive movement of the late 19th and early 20th century is Jane Addams, a central figure in that story as well as in the history of Chicago itself. So as part of your examination of the movement this week, you're going to be looking at a primary source generated by Jane Addams that speaks to the meaning of the settlement house movement. And one thing I wanted to add to that to provide some context is a video dealing with Jane Addams and the history of Hull House. So you'll have access to that through the week 2 module. In addition to that video, what we're looking at here on this page is a collection of artifacts from the Hull House Museum. Hull House still operates as a museum and a public space that's dedicated to social justice movements in the Chicagoland area. So it still actively maintains the mission that began with Jane Addams and her compatriot Ellen Gates Starr, as well as other progressive workers at Hull House during the history of the space. So when we look at artifacts themselves, what they can add to our understanding of history is context. Material objects can often tell a story that written primary sources can't convey to us, or at least not in the same way. So when we look at some of the artifacts here, I'll click on Ramallah, for example, just to give you some concrete examples of how material culture and objects can add a bit of nuance to our understanding of the past. This is one of the books that was used as part of a reading club at Hull House. It was one of the outreach efforts that progressive reformers engaged in that space to try to reach out to an immigrant community that was attempting to learn English, to become conversant in the popular culture of Chicago as they were integrating into society. So the Reading Club provided an outlet for immigrants who didn't have access to these kinds of opportunities anywhere else in the city. So just the simple example of a book that's part of the Hull House collection has a much bigger story to tell based on how it was used, why it was used, who used it, who owned it, all of that. So if you visit this page and click through some of the information there, it'll provide some of those interesting details that help to flesh out the story of what was taking place at Hull House in the midst of this progressive moment in early modern American history. The final object that I want to share with you out of the list here in the menu is the milk bottle. And again, not something that you would pay a lot of attention to. If you find a pop can on the side of the road, hopefully you're going to recycle it and not give it a second thought. But a milk bottle from the late 19th, early 20th century, again, has a more complex story to tell, in part because of the danger that was associated with drinking milk in the early modern era, and especially the impact on young children. Milk was not always a safe commodity, especially if you were from the lower rungs of American society. And as you can see on the image of the bottle here, it says absolutely pure milk. This is a new innovation to try to purify milk and keep it clean until it reaches the consumer so that you know that it's not contaminated. In fact, one of the bigger problems in Chicago is that the milk production was actually happening fairly close to one of the many breweries that existed in Chicago. And what they were actually feeding the cows is the swill that's left over from the brewing process for the beer. So all of that wheat that's left over after it's been fermented and turned into beer has virtually no nutritional value. So when the swill is being fed to the cows that are then producing the milk has no nutritional value. So one of the great challenges in the late 19th century in Chicago is that especially folks who are immigrants who are first arriving in the city or from the lower classes of Chicago society, their children are suffering from malnutrition, and that's an issue that Hull House tackled head on and was directly addressing to try to improve the lives of people living in the vicinity in the ward that Hull House is located in. So again, an object like this, a milk bottle, may not seem like it has a big story to tell, but when we contextualize it in this historical moment and associate it with Hull House, it has a very big story to tell. So I hope you enjoy going through some of these artifacts, taking a look at some of the details that it can give us, that they can give us, as we're trying to examine what the meaning of the progressive movement was in the late 19th, early 20th century. So I hope you enjoy this exhibition.